Okay, everyone. So, Jana has found some amazing books from our collections, and I think all credit to you for also providing these wonderful captions, so people do have a look at that, as well as the books. And these books are serious and text-heavy, but you've also made a valiant effort to show us some great images too. And I forgot to say, of course, I hope this isn't inauspicious, but it is Friday the 13th. Yes. So fingers crossed, but Jana, over to you.
Thank you, Chris, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. I'm really delighted to be presenting today, especially since it's Friday the 13th, a very appropriate day to be talking about superstition, the diabolical, and witches. And I also want to thank Elena especially for helping me set everything up. Thank you. So the material in front of you are 10 books that I have selected out of the books on witchcraft and magic that were collected by the British antiquarian Francis Douce, who served as the keeper of manuscripts in the British Museum and who had a special interest in literature of the early modern and the medieval times. He left his entire collection in 1834 to the University of Oxford, which, as you can see, also consists of some material on witchcraft. And I would like to start with the crucial question, who or what is a witch? I would like to draw your attention to the first book over here, because according to this pamphlet from 1653 that advises English jurymen on how to think critically on witchcraft cases, a witch is one that shall use, practice, or exercise any witchcraft, enchantment, charm, or sorcery, whereby any person shall be killed, destroyed, wasted, or consumed, pined, or lamed in or his or her body or any part thereof. And starting from this insight into how some of the material here and witchcraft imagination, the early modern period in general, could define a witch, I would like to focus now on two figures in particular, the figure of the witch and the figure of the child. And I would like to do so because I want to sort of break down what I would call the making of the witch, which refers not only to the to early modern media, such as literature, producing a newly consolidated figure of the witch in that period, but also to the very process of witch becoming as imagined by some of these books. And for me, there are at least 3 distinct ways in which the child is immanent in these books. And I want to start with the most obvious one, the child as the victim of witchcraft. The second book over here, a pamphlet from 1645, recalls a woman named Mary Johnson being accused of having killed a 2-year-old child by witchcraft. The mother of the child, Annabel Durand, testifies that Mary has complimented her child, stroked its face, and then gave it some bread and butter. After that, the child went ill and died shortly after 8 days of continued screaming. Mary Johnson was one of the persons executed and accused in the Essex witch trials of 1645, the largest witch trials in English history that led to over 100 executions and that were led by no other than the self-proclaimed witch finder general himself, Matthew Hopkins, that you can see here on the front page. And causing the death of a child is also one of the charges in yet another really big witch hunt that took place around 50 years later in the New World, and that would become perhaps the most famous witch trials of all time. And according to clergyman Cotton Mather, who you can see over there, who is the chief apologist of the Salem witch trials, a man called Samuel Gray testified that he woke up 14 years earlier in the middle of the night, seeing a woman standing in his room right next to his child's cradle. He rose up and asked her, "In God's name, why have you come?" But the woman disappeared. The child also began to scream and then died as well about 8 months later. So the woman that Samuel believed to have seen in his room was called Bridget Bishop, who was the first to be executed in Salem in 1692. And the book that Cotton Mather based his ideas on, and the demonology that inspired not only the Salem witch trials but many others, is called the Sadducismus Triumphatus, a demonology from 1681, written by Joseph Glanville, a graduate from Exeter and Lincoln College here in Oxford, actually. So, as you can imagine, Glanville as well recounts the story of a witch sort of bewitching or cursing a child. This child was named Edith, a 10-year-old girl who stepped on the toes of a Alice Duke, who then wished the pox on her. And Edith didn't die, but she became ill. And since she didn't die and did see her perpetrator sort of accused and punished, we arrive at the second instance in which the child is imminent in all of these books, which is the child as the witness. And for that, I will now turn to these 3 books, which are counter-writings on demonology. So the first one being a book by George Gifford over here, who argued that witches were real, but witchcraft accusations often did stem from superstition, so it was sort of a more critical perspective on that. He critiqued the way in which children were often forced, or at least encouraged, to even accuse their own parents of witchcraft. And we will find an even more critical perspective on that in these 2 books, which are the same text. This is basically the quintessential anti-demonology written in 1584 by an English politician called Reginald Scott. We have it here in the first edition and here in another edition from 1655. He had picked the very ironic title, The Discovery of Witchcraft, which not only attests to the irony of even infants and small children being allowed to testify in court against adults in cases of witchcraft, but also to the irony of those adults being found guilty immediately for witchcraft whenever a child is harmed or killed, unless proven otherwise. He was, of course, right in his claim that witchcraft accusations did often stem from fear, anxiety, imagination, rumor, even the art of deception and magic tricks, which he also explains in his book that contains one of the earliest printed explanations of stage magic tricks. And with that, I think that his approach also sheds light to another question, which is, why is the witch in the first place regarded or imagined as being perpetrating children? And I think this really brings us to the last instance in which the child is present in these books, which is the child as a sacrifice to witchcraft. Because I would say we have to remember, or we must bear in mind, that according to early modern witchcraft belief systems, the witch was not born a witch. The witch is human that becomes a witch due to choices she makes or he makes, and the practices they would engage in, starting of course with the Devil's Pact. So being a witch is not really thought of as a sort of fate, but as a consequence and, more important, a choice. And according to this pamphlet from 1673, which recalls the instance of 8 German witches killing more than 145 children in order to make a special ointment, which this pamphlet from 1646 explains they learned from the devil himself or from demons, which they would met in the witches on the witches' Sabbath, the secret nightly gathering of witches, demons, and familiars. But why would they need such an ointment? To understand why, we now turn to the last book that I have selected for today, the most infamous book of all of these, and perhaps, according to Hans-Peter Brödel, who wrote a monography on that book, the indeed most quoted, most well-known, and indeed most infamous text of all medieval texts, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. In this demonology, the Inquisitor of southern Germany, Heinrich Kramer, possibly together with Jakob Springer, declared that witches have to make a paste from the limbs of children, especially those killed by them before baptism, and smear it on some seed or a piece of wood. When this has been done, they are immediately carried into the air, whether by day or night, and visibly, or if they wish, invisibly. So there is, of course, much more to say about children and fertility or infertility and reproduction in all of these texts. But when we look at this demonology from 1486 and we see that the child is the most important, crucial ingredient or component of the witch's most important and most famous ability, the witch's flight, we see that the witch and the child are connected in many ways, and that the child is an integral part if we want to understand how the witch was imagined in early modern literature. So with that, I would like to conclude this little presentation, and thank you for your time, for your interest, and I wish you all a very lovely and witchy weekend.
Thank you, Jana. And you said you were going to take 8 minutes. I think you did. You didn't take up the 10, and you managed to pack in an amazing amount of information.
But I also didn't breathe. So.
Okay. When you mentioned Francis Douce, from whose collections this came, I remembered that Douce gave everything to the Bodleian because he hated his employer. He was there for just 5 years, and he wrote an amazing letter explaining his reasons. And we have the letter here, and essentially, I won't read it out, but he summed up the fact that he hated the working conditions, the dysfunctional management, difficult colleagues, and the damp environment, ineffective, arrogant committee members, and last but not least, the repulsive staff. But it's much better here. All right, another round of applause for